A lot of times we start off in a particular direction, and we start to do something, and we forget what we intended to do before we were doing that. And this is my 19th year as a pastor. Next year, July, will begin my 20th year as a pastor. Some of you are thinking, did you start when you were 12? Yeah, thanks. But no. But before that, I was an engineer. I worked for an engineering firm, and I studied engineering in college. I actually have my license to practice engineering. But before that, my interest, my plan was to go into politics. A lot of people don't know that. When I was 7 years old, my family, we took a trip to Washington, D.C. It turned out that in 1984, when we took that trip, that my wife was living in Washington, D.C. She was born in D.C., but we didn't meet on that particular occasion. But on the way up there, we stopped at several historical places. That's one thing that my family did on trips. We stopped at Yorktown and stopped at Williamsburg and Jamestown, historical places, important places in American history. And so as a result of that trip, going to Washington, the capital, seeing all the sights there, I came away as a very patriotic kid. Very patriotic kid. In fact, in 1986, a couple years after that, the President of the United States came to Dothan, Alabama. At that time, Ronald Reagan was coming to campaign for Jeremiah Denton, who was a United States Senator who was in a tight race with Richard Shelby for Senate. And he flew into Dothan. He went to the Civic Center to campaign. He had a meal, and he flew out. And it just so happens that the flight pattern over Dothan to Dothan, Abbeville, where I'm from, is about 20 minutes north of Dothan. The flight pattern is right over my house. And so when I saw the plane taking off from Dothan, I went outside with, and there was a jet that flew over our house. I went outside with an American flag, and I was waving it, just certain that Ronnie was going to look out the window and see this kid in the ground waving an American flag, patriotic kid. And that continued. It continued into my high school years in college. And so when I was in college, I got involved in a political organization on campus. In fact, I worked my way up to becoming the vice president of that political organization. I ran for the Student Government Association, SGA Senate at Auburn, and was elected my junior year. I was one of 4 out of 13 that ran, representing the College of Engineering. I actually got more votes that year than a guy who almost won SGA president the next year. And so at that political organization, which was a national political organization, not a campus, not just for the campus, but nationwide, it was the most influential political organization on campus. I mean, 22,000 students at Auburn at that time. We were the most influential. We were sought out by people who were running for Congress, running for Senate, like the head of the National Rifle Association called and said, I want to come to Auburn and speak to students. And so he wanted to come with, and so we arranged that. And so as a result of being the vice president, I was also on the executive committee of this organization. And so I got an all-expense-paid trip to go to Washington, D.C. that summer to be a part of the national convention. And so I was excited about that, got to go and meet a lot of famous politicians, people who were in Congress, senators, people who had run for president. And so when I got there, I meet with our delegation, my fellow group of the executive committee of our organization there at Auburn, we met up with the people from Alabama, University of Alabama. So I was told immediately that you are to vote for Joe. We have to support Joe. Joe's running for president of the organization nationwide, and he was from the University of Alabama, so we're trying to get our Alabama groups together to lobby together for Joe. And so my first reaction to that is, but I don't even know Joe. Why should I support Joe? And then later I got to meet Joe, and I thought, I don't know if I even like Joe. So how can I support Joe? Well, this whole experience was kind of disillusioning for me. At that season of my life, I kind of had these ideals. I don't know if you've ever seen the movies from like 75 years ago or 80 years ago. The Mr. Smith Goes to Washington, and I went to Washington with high ideals, and I was kind of disillusioned. It's sort of the values that we said that were important for us and for our group that I didn't really see it being expressed in my colleagues, those who were there with me, fellow college students from our organization. The language, the things that we talked about. There was one guy who was my roommate, who was assigned a roommate, a fellow delegate who left in the middle of the night to go have a rendezvous with a female delegate. I was kind of like, wow, okay. And And it turns out that when the vote went down for these are the future leaders of America. When the vote went down, like for president, that Joe barely lost. I mean, it was so close, but he lost. And so all the supporters of Joe said, we were robbed. And so we're going to leave this convention. We're going to go to another part of the hotel and have our own convention and elect Joe as our president. And I'm like, what? Who cares? Who cares about this? And so it was a disillusioning experience for me. I came back home. About that time, I was feeling maybe I was called by God to enter the ministry, become a pastor, and a pastor's involvement in politics. I really don't agree with that and think that it really limits the ability to reach people. And so I came back home and I resigned from that political organization, from being vice president of that organization, and began to pursue a call to ministry. So I left government and pursuing the politics of government to go into the church, to become a pastor in the church where there is no politics. And no, there are sometimes politics in the church too. And some of you have been burned by that, and sometimes you have experienced that. Sadly, anytime there are a group of people, there are compromises, there's politics that's involved. But I will say, of all the places that I've been, I've served some great churches, 3 great churches in 19 years. And that has been minimized. I have not seen a lot of that. And at Mulder, there's less of that than any other place I've ever seen. And so I hope that amen. Somebody, clapping out there. It's true. We want to strive to be like Jesus and avoid some of those ugly things that you see that happen a lot of times when politics get involved. But what I experienced through that experience was a gap. I experienced a gap between my ideals, in other words, what I believe the way that things should be, versus reality, the way that things actually are. I had in my mind sort of the way things would be, and then it turned out that it wasn't that way. And that not just true in terms of politics, in terms of, like my experience, it's true in terms of campaign promises. They're the ideals. These are the promises I'm going to make to you. But then a lot of times as we listen to those promises, we don't realize that reality is that one person can't do all of that we have balance of powers. There's reality. Sometimes that's true in terms of religion, the church, any group of people you approach with ideals, and there's a gap between those ideals and reality. And what happens is that as we bump up against reality with our ideals, especially if it feels like again and again and again and again, those ideals turn out not to be in line with the way things really are, it can lead to being jaded, a sense of jadedness or a sense of disillusionment or a loss even of those ideals. Maybe those ideals that I had, they were wrong all along. Maybe they weren't really worth believing, and maybe I was just a sucker in believing all of those ideals. That happens. I mean, if there's one of these two that you will compromise on, when it comes to compromising on the way things are really going to be or compromising on our ideas, which are you more likely to compromise on? It will be on your ideals. Which one are you more likely to move the goalposts? It will be ideals to accommodate to the real world, right? Well, let's use different terminology to describe it. Let's say instead of ideals, we use the term values. I mean, that's a great word. We hear about family values or Christian values or American values, all of those things. Values on the one hand and results on the other. I've got 2 goalposts up here. These are soccer goalposts. We think about the term moving the goalposts, changing the rules of the game midstream. It comes from an analogy related to soccer. You move the goalpost, you change the game, you potentially change the score. And I think for a lot of people, especially like people who are elected to Congress and politics, people who run for office, who get into the arena in that sense, typically Congress has like the lowest approval rating. They're like 20% is good, for Congress. People generally hate Congress, but they like the person who represents them in Congress. I think that people say, well, they're all corrupt. I don't believe that. I think that many people run with sincere values. They believe in their values strongly, but what happens is that in that world, there is the reality of getting to the place of results. Sometimes there is compromise in terms of values to get to results. And we are quick to criticize people who are in the arena. Remember, spectators criticize, difference makers capitalize on their opportunities. But sometimes you're in the same place. You will compromise on one for the sake of the other. There's a belief a lot of times that one of these are going to get adjusted. So a lot of times we choose to compromise on values. For example, an extreme example. Do we have a value? Can we say that lying is wrong? Speaking untruths. That's against our values. I think we would agree that that's true. At least I hope we could all agree on that. But there's a story from the book The Hiding Place. Corrie ten Boom, who lived in Holland in World War II, who was hiding Jews in their home, the ten Booms hiding Jews in their home from the Gestapo. The Nazis, the soldiers who were coming around arresting and herding Jewish people into train cars to carry them into concentration camps. And on one occasion, the Gestapo comes to the ten Boom home and says, "Are you hiding any Jews?" And the little girl in the household, who's been taught that Jesus never wants you to lie, says, "Yes, we are." And the family, of course, is horrified. Because she's a little girl, they're able to explain it away. They say, "No, we are not hiding Jews." They lie for the sake of the result of saving the lives of those they are hiding as well as their own. What about the value of do not steal, right? I mean, that's one of the 10 Commandments. It's not stealing one of your values. Of course, I hope so. But what if your family is starving? What if your children are starving? Would you compromise on the value of stealing for the result of having something to eat? Now, some of you say, "I wouldn't steal no matter what. I would rather starve," and I respect that, okay? But some of us, if you were ever in that desperate of a place, many of us, maybe most of us, we wouldn't. We might compromise. Or what about when it comes to obeying the law? Should we obey the law? Is that one of our values? Absolutely. That's one of our values. That's in the Bible. It says, obey those who are in authority. These are people God has put in authority over you. But what if it's an unjust law? For example, what if that law says that black people can sit in one part of the bus and white people can sit in another part of the bus, which the laws in this state said not too many years ago defended this practice? What about in that case? There were some brave people who stepped up and said, we are not going to obey that law, not just for our sakes, because it's unjust, not just for our sakes, but for our children and for people all over this country. And today we look back as that as a heroic moment where values were compromised or adjusted or not kept for the sake of results. Now it's this tricky issue. It's tricky when we choose not to obey laws, because sometimes, how do you decide who decides which laws are just and which are unjust? You decide that yourself. Does you become a law unto yourself? It's a complicated matter. There's all kind of justice issues out there for us to claim and to call. So it's a complex issue. But what about, let's take it to another level of controversy. What about when it comes to national policy? National policy, okay? Is it against our values to assassinate someone's character? To assault them on Twitter or Facebook or make up lies about them, do whatever has to be done to get rid of this person, to get them out of office, to keep them from taking office, whatever it is. Is that against our values? Well, yeah, that's against our values, but what if the result is if the future of the country is at stake? The result could be the loss of our country, that we have to save our country, so we will compromise on a value for the sake of a result? Or what if it's a value of non-discrimination? I mean, that's a value that all people are created equal. That's what our Declaration of Independence says. If you're a Christian, you have to believe that. You have to believe that if you're a Christian and you're not a Jewish person, if you're a Gentile, that God doesn't see this color of our skin, that prejudice is against Christian teaching, then how in the world could we have laws in our state that were by nature prejudiced and dividing people and discriminating against people? How could that ever happen by supposedly people who were supposed to be Christians, unless somehow in their mind they said the results would be so terrible that we would lose our society, or whatever there was rationale, that there was a compromise on that value for the sake of a result? Is anybody following me here at all? Are you following me? There's a gap. And we tend to compromise on our values for the sake of results. If you can follow me, you've just entered the world of Judas Iscariot. Judas Iscariot, one of the greatest villains of all time. In fact, he's worse than a villain. He's a traitor. Nobody names their kid Judas anymore. I mean, how many Judases are walking around? They're not there. Judas is a takeoff of the Hebrew name Judah, which means praise. Judah being the ancestor of David and Jesus and so many important people, the greatest tribe in Israel, Judah, at least as far as their number of people. Judas, who became a villain, who was in the inner circle, who turned Jesus over to the villains. Judas, who is portrayed in Dante's Inferno as being in the lowest place of hell with Satan himself. Judas, who betrayed or handed over Jesus. But why? Why did he do it? Generally, it's kind of believed that Judas betrayed Jesus for money. He is portrayed as being greedy for money in the New Testament, in the Gospels. But some of Judas's behavior, especially afterward, seems to indicate that money wasn't his motivation, at least his primary motivation, in betraying Jesus. Okay? Just follow me, for example. For as the next day began to unfold, and it became clear that Jesus was not going to get out of this alive, suddenly everything changed for Judas. Look what happened in Matthew chapter 27, beginning in verse 3. We're told that when Judas, who had betrayed Jesus, saw that he was condemned, the Sanhedrin had condemned him, he'd been sent over to Pilate, it was clear Jesus was not going to get out of this alive, that he was seized with remorse and returned the 30 pieces of silver to the chief priests and the elders. I have sinned, he said, for I have betrayed innocent blood. When they say, what is that to us? They replied, that's your responsibility. That's on you. So, if what happened was what Judas had expected to happen, that he would hand Jesus over to the chief priests, leading them to Jesus in a place where he gathered with his disciples in the middle of the night. It was discreet. It was under the cover of darkness. No one would know. If what happened was what Judas had expected to happen, why did he return the money? If he did it for money, why would he give back the money after what he had expected to happen had happened? Except what happened wasn't what Judas expected. On top of that, 30 pieces of silver is not that much money. He should have asked for more than that. He should have wanted more than that if he was greedy for money. And look at what happened next. What does Judas do after this? They're like, we won't take your money. Well, he throws it into the temple and leaves, and then he takes his own life. He went away and hanged himself. How would someone who had just accomplished what they wanted to accomplish, gotten what they agreed to, take their own life? What happened? Well, I think what happened for Judas is Judas's values got sideways of the results, or his ideals got sideways with reality. Who was Judas, after all? Well, the name Judas, I told you, comes from the Hebrew word that means praise, Judah. But the name Iscariot, typically we look at it as his last name. It's actually not his last name. It's more of a descriptor to those to whom he belonged. It's sort of his tribe or his party, if you will. Iscariot is most likely a derivation of the Aramaic term Sicarii, which translated means the assassins, or the people of the dagger. You see, the Sicarii were a group of zealots who were Jewish nationalists who wanted to restore the glory of Israel and of the Jewish nation by casting off the yoke of the Romans. And the only way that they believed or that they could see in a practical, real world that this could happen would be militarily. That it would have to happen by violence. And so, in order for this to take place, this group of people, they bonded together, they banded together, they conspired together to restore the freedom of God's people. After all, God made them to be free. God set them free from Pharaoh and from Egypt. And now here's this other oppressive Caesar and Rome oppressing God's people. They should not be this. Should not be this way. Cast off the yoke, assert our rights, declare our freedom. So you might wonder, why would Jesus have someone from the group known as the dagger, the assassins, with his group? Why would Jesus want Judas amongst his inner circle? Well, Jesus had people from all different walks of life among his disciples. I mean, we know that the 12 disciples was made up of a tax collector, someone who was in cahoots with Rome, making money from the Romans, corrupt, hated by the general populace. He had fishermen who were common people, ordinary, uneducated people. It seems that most likely he also had some from the upper echelons of society who were educated. And he had at least one other zealot. Simon the Zealot was one of Jesus' disciples. And so Jesus called people from all walks of life, as you would expect, because Jesus changed their life. And he brought people from all different kind of backgrounds and political perspectives, and they came to follow Jesus, to believe Jesus was the Messiah, and to get plugged in and involved in his ministry and in his mission. They were changed by Jesus. And so it's not hard to get into Judas's mind here. Maybe it's not so hard after all. I mean, here's a guy who's following Jesus. He's bought in. He thinks that Jesus could be the one to restore the nation to glory, the Messiah. That's what they all believed. They were all waiting for the moment when Jesus was going to set up his throne. He was going to kick Caesar out. And so Judas starts hearing Jesus talk about this trip to Jerusalem. And there's going to be this confrontation with the leaders in Jerusalem. And he starts talking about dying. And that's what the zealots were all about. They're like, yeah, we may die, but better our necks be cut, our blood in the streets, than to be slaves to the Romans. And so he's thinking, Jesus is starting, this thing is going down. And I bet Jesus, he's throwing hints. He's ready for us to take action. It's time to get this thing ready. because we're going to Jerusalem and the Passover is near. And if there's one thing we need to leverage to get the Romans off our backs, is to leverage the power of the mob. For on Passover, the city of Jerusalem, the population swelled to over 1 million people as pilgrims came from all over the world to celebrate Passover. The Romans sent more soldiers in. Pilate himself came from Caesarea to Jerusalem for crowd control. And so here is the moment. Here is the moment. The only way we can overcome the Romans is sheer by the mass, the numbers of people, that there's so many of us that we overwhelm them. And so I'm just going to help Jesus out. And then they get to Jerusalem and they're sitting around the table, and Jesus looks at Judas and he says, what you're going to do it quickly. And so Judas is like, he's in on it. He's given me the go-ahead. All we need is for the people to rise up. And what would cause them to rise up except to see this man Jesus, who's got so much charisma, who the crowds love, who seems to have miraculous power, who teaches with authority. When they see him arrested and at the mercy of the Romans, then they will fight. And maybe even more than that, Jesus himself will fight. And we will be free. Except he doesn't. And so can you imagine on that Friday, as the religious leaders who are wise to all this, they've got their dispatches in the crowd, stirring up the crowd to have Jesus to be crucified. And Pilate, in some political shrewdness, says, I'll release one prisoner to you. Pilate wanted to keep a riot from happening too. And so the crowd was stirred up to release Barabbas. The riot was averted, and Jesus went to his death. And so suddenly, the plot unraveled. It didn't work. And here's Judas, a man who has betrayed, handed over, someone who all he did in his life was help people, who blessed them, who spoke of peace, and now he's being murdered, executed horribly by the Romans. Can you catch a glimpse at the despair of Judas Iscariot? You see, Judas compromised on his values to get results. And as a result, he got neither. It didn't work. Sure, I'm handing over Jesus, I'm being underhanded. We're working under the cloak of darkness. But sometimes you got to do what you got to do. I'm got to force his hands. We got to be free. Except it didn't work. It didn't work for him, and it won't work for you. See, if we're going to move a goalpost, the goalpost that we move is our values. Because after all, we live in the real world, right? I mean, technically, cheating is wrong. Lying is wrong. I signed that thing at the bottom of my taxes on penalty of perjury. But the government, they got plenty of money. They don't need my money. I need my money. And I'm going to manage it better than they will. Sure, in terms of moral values, traditionally we think about sexual behavior, waiting till marriage and all of that. That's what happens to your results, by the way, when you do that. But I don't want to be alone. And they might break up with me if I don't. He might break up with me if I don't give him what he wants. We move the goalposts on our values. What about when it comes to kindness and respect? Treating others the way that we want to be treated, gossip and such as that. But we want to be accepted in the in crowd. So we move our values for the sake of everybody else around us. It's interesting that Jesus was a celibate male his whole life who lived a fulfilled life in a relationship with other people. Jesus always paid his taxes even though he didn't have to. Jesus lived by his values. He spoke the truth to everyone. And Jesus accomplished the results by never compromising on his values. And how could he do that? Except that he trusted that the one who accomplished the results was the one who had given the values. He trusts the one whose values he was given would accomplish the results. And that's what happens when we compromise on our values. The reason that we do so is because we don't trust the one who gives them. When we stop trusting God with the results, we stop living by God's values. You see, friends, not all ends justify the means. Means matter just as much as ends do. Jesus wouldn't have accomplished the results if he did not live by the values. The means are the way to the ends. And so instead of taking things into our own hands, living by our own values, we surrender in trust. Jesus did this in trust to the one who sets those values. And this is ultimately what Judas could not do. Judas couldn't do that. He couldn't trust God because the results were his God. He couldn't live in a country where the Romans oppressed his people. He couldn't live like that. He couldn't live. There was no future to him apart from his venture, that conspiracy succeeding, because he had to save his people, but what he couldn't see was that they needed saving from something deeper than a political reality. You see, Judas doesn't know a God of death and resurrection. All Judas knows is death. To him, death is the end. That's it. There's nothing else. If we fail, this is the end. The death of our nation is the death of hope. The death of these plans, there's nothing beyond it. Jesus saw beyond death. He saw even beyond his own physical death. He saw a resurrection. And so you have two people, Jesus and Judas. Both of them die on the same day. One of them has lost all hope and takes his own life. One of them is filled with hope and yields up his life. One of them takes matters into his own hands, literally tying the rope himself. The other surrenders to God, refusing to compromise on his value. He surrenders literally with his hands being stretched out as he dies on a cross. Could the contrast be any more explicit? So if you were there on that Friday, and you encountered Judas Iscariot on the way from the temple to the place, the field where he's going to hang himself, what would you say to him? What would you say to Judas? You scoundrel, how could you do that? Maybe you would say that, I don't know, but we're 2,000 years later. And knowing Judas's perspective now and what Judas really wanted, what would you say? Judas, I know you think all is lost, but it's not. Just wait 2 more days. Just wait 2 days. I promise you, in 2 days, you will see everything differently. Judas, I know right now all seems lost, but listen, this is not the end. Consider the end of the story. Why don't you do the same? Why don't you do the same? To let go of all of those results that you have to have, that all values are relative to be able to get there. Or maybe it's where you are now, the relationship you're in now, the place you are in now, and you're here because you didn't compromise on your values back then. And you're thinking, wow, I was so naive, so stupid. Why did I do that? Things could have turned out better if I just hadn't have been so goody two-shoes back then. Listen, the only thing worse than looking back and wishing you had maybe fudged on you hadn't lived by your values is to look back and realize that you didn't. And not living by those values. Consider the end of the story. And be true to those values. Don't move the goalpost on your values. Even when everybody says you're crazy, what are you, living in the 18th century? You know, what's wrong with you? Be true to your values. Because ultimately, you know the end of the story. And you know that the God who gives the values is the God who will accomplish the results. And so for even the biggest mess-ups, the worst failures, when all of your plans went wrong and you fudged on those values and you didn't get the results, all is not lost. God can work even the most maladjusted means toward redemptive ends because we serve a God of death and resurrection. So would you put your trust in that God today? Would you relinquish control and say, I'm going to live by what I know is right, by what God says is right, and I'm going to trust God with the results, even when I can't see the ending. Would you do that today? Because He is a God. Let me tell you about our God. Our God is able to do above and beyond what we ask or imagine. And I say that to you as a man who married at 37 years old, who saved himself for marriage, who all of my friends thought, or people said, what's wrong with you? Let me tell you, God is able to do above and beyond what you ask or imagine. Don't compromise on your values because of the lie of the world that it's the only way you can get results.